ventral tumors which are ventral to the pons as well as the midbrain, as well as the infiltrated tentorium with little of temporal lobe retraction. So particularly petroclival meningiomas extending to the middle cranial fossa either by the direct invasion or through the Meckel's cave or tentorial notch. So this is the type C approach. So supratentorial as well as the infratemporal tentorial part of the tumors are addressed. Means it is superior extension of this approach. So, indications are petroclival lesions with supratentorial extensions. So coming to type D approach, which is nothing but the inferior extension of the type A approach. So type A was limited only to the lower clivus and the jugular foramen, lower clivus as well as the jugular foramen. So this approach was extended like this, that is petro-occipital transsigmoid approach, so that we will get the access to these regions also. So what are the indications? So lower and mid clivus lesions such as chordomas with the involvement of lower clivus, petroclival meningiomas, and extensive lower cranial nerve schwannomas. So this completes the transtemporal approach and surgical anatomy and its indication. Now further, the surgical steps will be dealt by Dr. Sampath Chandra Prasad Rao sir. Thank you for the opportunity to present this seminar. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a brief overview and a small trailer of all the things to come. And it's very important. This, I always keep saying that no amount of reinforcement is enough when it comes to the services, lateral and these are difficult areas. And one, oh, sorry. Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you now.
Okay, so okay. So I was telling that this was just an overview of switch off your, yeah. Can you see the full screen now?
Yes, sir. Now we can see the full screen.
Okay, great. So I was telling that that was a brief introduction, overview, and it's always good to reinforce concepts, anatomy. These are difficult areas, and it's always good to keep going through these things over and over again. So what Kavita told you was a brief overview. I'm going to tell much more about some of these areas, some of these approaches, and hopefully that will reinforce the concepts to an extent that it stays well within your memories. So the transtemporal approaches to the cerebellopontine angle are primarily of importance to ENT surgeons, because as ENT surgeons, and I'm an ENT surgeon, we are all well aware of the anatomy of the mastoid and the surrounding areas. So it's only natural for an ENT surgeon to carry this forward into the deeper aspects of the skull base. So there are many more approaches to the skull base. Skull base, I always keep telling that the territory of the skull base can be divided into an intracranial territory, a transtemporal territory, or a temporal territory, and the infratemporal territory. So adding up all these spaces, one comprehensively comes to know what is skull base. So skull base cannot be practiced, at least as far as I'm concerned, or as far as my opinion goes. Skull base surgery cannot be practiced in bits and pieces. If you are the master of only the intracranial approaches, or only the transtemporal approaches, or only the infratemporal and the neck approaches, you would then be retrofitting your approach to the pathology and not vice versa. It's always important to know everything and apply the right approach to the patient. Now, for instance, if there's a fairly big acoustic neuroma and the hearing is completely gone, there's practically no serviceable hearing. So it would then make sense for one to go through the temporal bone, get additional exposure, avoid brain retraction, and get into the cerebellopontine angle. If there is any amount of hearing that
Sampachandra sir,
that is
sorry to
preserved,
disturb you.
or if the
There
hearing
are
is
many.
good in smaller tumors or even in mid-sized tumors, it's always wise to go
Sir, excuse
via
me,
the
sir.
retrosigmoid approach or the suboccipital approaches.
Hello,
And
sir.
to be
Uh,
able to justify your approach, you need to know the approaches in the first place, isn't it? So only when you know the entire gamut of approaches, you would then be able to do justice to your patient. Today, we are going to deal with
Hello,
one
sir.
aspect
Excuse me,
of
sir.
the skull base,
Sampachandra
that
sir.
is the temporal. Earlier, in the earlier webinar, we did the infratemporal fossa. Now we're going one step above, and we're dealing with all the approaches that go through the temporal bone, which involves a fair amount of drilling and a fair amount of knowledge of the anatomy of those areas. In the future classes, we'll probably go into the more superior aspects, as the intracranial aspects of the lateral skull base. So what are we going to deal with today? We are essentially going to begin with what is called a subtotal petrosectomy, carry that forward to a translabyrinthine approach. The transaortic approach is a further expansion of the translabyrinthine approach. And then we have the transcochlear approaches, which are fairly wide approaches. Now, there is another approach called the middle fossa approach, which also can be considered as a transtemporal approach, or it's somewhere in between intracranial and transtemporal approach, because it involves drilling almost all parts of the temporal bone, and you can use that approach to go far medially into the petrous apex regions. The rest of the approaches, the translabyrinthines, subtotal petrous, translabyrinth, transaortic, transcochlear approaches, are all frank lateral approach, which involves a postoral incision and proceeds with a mastectomy right in the beginning. Now, before we get into the details, I would like to tell you that at World Skull Base, we do what is called the World Skull Base Fellowship Diploma in lateral, and now from this year onwards in anterior skull base surgery as well. Unfortunately, due to the COVID virus, we will be postponing this to next year. So 2020 event will be organized in 2021. And here you get to see the entire spectrum of what we cover in lateral skull base surgery. So what begins with the canaloplasty ends with ABI's far lateral approach and the combined transcondylar approaches. So there are a lot of approaches. So if you are serious about learning skull base surgery, you need to know everything. Otherwise, you'll be one of those skull base surgeons who retrofits an approach to what you know, rather than adapt an approach to the tumor, the best approach to the concerning tumor. Now, what are the pathologies of the CPA? What are the lesions that one can use these approaches for? So a transtemporal approach. So if there is a big acoustic nerve vestibular schwannoma like this, then one can go through the temporal bone and remove this tumor. This is a meningioma. This is a trigeminal schwannoma. So all these tumors of the cerebellopontine angle can be dealt with, of the posterior fossa can be dealt with the transtemporal approaches. The tumors of the middle fossa include facial nerve tumors, trigeminal tumors, endolymphatic sac tumors, some of which Kavita also referred to, dermoids and epidermoids. Petrous bone cholestoma, petrous apex cholesterol granuloma, some of which go into the cerebellopontine angle. Chordomas and chondrosarcomas also tend to go into the CP angle, as you see in this picture. Tympanojugular paragangliomas, lower cranial schwannomas also tend to get into the CP angle. That apart, we also know that the cochlear implants, auditory mediastinum implants, and the hearing restoration procedures associated with tumors of the CP angle also have to be dealt with simultaneously while doing some of these approaches. For instance, you can do a cochlear implant along with the translabyrinthine approach. You can do a auditory brainstem implant along with the translabyrinthine approach. That apart, facial nerve grafting in case of facial nerve sectioning that could occur either due to the tumor or due to the procedure itself, and facial nerve restitution in terms of sural nerve or great auricular nerve anastomosis can be done in the cerebellopontine angle. So these are the reasons why one would use these approaches in the cerebellopontine angle. Now let's begin with a simple subtotal petrosectomy. Subtotal petrosectomy, I always say, is an interface between otology and skull base surgery. Why is it an interface between otology and skull-based surgery? Because this is one of the first steps of skull-based surgery, and the crossover happens here. So a subtotal petrosectomy essentially involves three things. One is it involves a blind sac closure. This is a radical cavity that is closed. Radical mastectomy means that the mastoid cavity is open to the outside. A radical cavity that is closed to the external environment completely is called a subtotal petrosectomy. And the name might sound a little confusing. Petrosectomy may not sound or look equal to a radical mastectomy, but the reason why we call it a subtotal petrosectomy is because we stop at the petrous bone, the otic capsule, and all these structures that you see in this picture, the jugular bulb, the promontory ica, all these are a part of the petrous part of the temporal bone. So that's and since it's not a total petrosectomy, which means that a total petrosectomy obviously means going all the way up to the petrous apex, and since the petrous bone is intact, we call it a subtotal petrosectomy. And this can be pushed further depending on the indications and the pathology. For instance, if there is a lesion that erodes the labyrinth, you could destroy the labyrinth and do a radical cavity with the labyrinthectomy, radical cavity with the cochleectomy, radical cavity with the ICA exposure, jugular bulb exposure. So there is no upper limit to a subtotal petrosectomy. You can do whatever you want. So it involves a blind sac closure, involves a canal wall down mastectomy with excenteration of all the mastoid cells and preservation of the otic capsule. Now this is plus or minus. Preservation of the otic capsule was what was first described by Hugo Fish when he first used the word subtotal petrosectomy. He said it has to be preserved. Later on, when indications were extended, it was realized that it's not always necessary to preserve the otic capsule. Finally, you obliterate the cavity from the external environment by 1, by closing the eustachian tube, 2, by doing what is called a blind sac closure. So 2 things will close this cavity completely, and you can use a little bit of an abdominal fat to close this. So this is essentially subtotal petrosectomy. Incision is postoral, wide postoral incision. Flaps are elevated in subcutaneous plane and the musculoperiosteal planes, as I told you in the previous lecture. The external aortic canal is then closed. Give me a minute. I need to make sure that this is not in automatic mode. Just 1 second. I hope it works now. Sorry. Okay. So the external aortic canal, as I was telling, no, it's I need to just sort this out. Okay, let's see. Let's hope it works. Okay, so the external aortic canal is transected at the, as I told you last time, at the junction between the bony and the cartilaginous, just a little lateral to the bony cartilaginous junction. So once you transect it nicely, you then from medially, that is from inside, you separate the external aortic canal skin from the cartilage. It's very important that you do a proper blind sac closure. Why is it important to do a proper blind sac closure? Because if there is any small hole or a fistula that's left behind, then over a period of time, you will see that the patient would have developed a massive petrous bone cholestoma, because you have now created a pathway. There is nothing inside except a cavity, and laterally you have created a small fistula through which the epithelium can grow into this cavity that you have created, and the entire disease that you have cleared can be replaced by a iatrogenic petrous bone cholestoma or petrous cholestoma. So it's very important that you begin by doing a perfect blind sac closure without causing a fistula. So once you separate the cartilage from the external aortic meatus, you then turn this inside out and stitch the skin using Vicryl. You do not use non-absorbable sutures. You use absorbable sutures because you don't want to go in later and fiddle around and be removing all these sutures. You would rather let it heal by itself and get absorbed. So you're going to use a absorbable Weichel 30 sutures or 40 sutures to close the skin inside out. So this is the first layer. So once this is done, you then go into the cartilage layer. The cartilage layer is the same as this layer. So what you do is, since this is turned inside out and sutured, this is then released a little bit and sutured to either the skin above, or if in fairly older people, you'll get the conchal cartilage, and it is possible to suture the conchal cartilage to the anterior cartilage. Okay, so that forms the second layer. So with these two layers, 1 and 2, you have created a perfect blind sac closure, and a perfect blind sac closure will not give way, and there won't be any incidence or chance of a iatrogenic cholesterol if you do a perfect blind sac closure. So this is the fundamental step, and I always tell my associates, people who come and observe me, that the blind sac closure better be done right in the beginning, because after at the end of the surgery, you might have difficult tumors, and you will be operating for 10, 12, 14 hours. At the end of the procedure, your concentration levels will not be high. So at the end of that procedure, if you were to do a blind sac closure, there is a possibility that you may not do it perfectly well, and whatever you have done, the good work that you have done, can be submerged, drained by a bad blind sac closure. Once you've done a blind sac closure, you proceed with mastectomy. These are all simple steps. We've been through this yesterday, so I'm going to go quickly. You do a canal wall down mastectomy and proceed to completely skeletonize middle fossa dura, sigmoid sinus, sinodural angle, remove all the mastoid cells, no big rocket science, remove the bridge, lower the facial ridge, remove the ossicles, malleus incus stapes have to be removed, the semicircular canals have to be identified. Okay, the facial nerve is completely skeletonized from the geniculate ganglion up to the stylomastoid foramen, and the digastric ridge is clearly seen. All the air cells are excentrated. I prefer, a lot of people ask me whether all the cells really need to be excentrated in a subtotal petrosectomy. See, when do you do a subtotal petrosectomy? In my practice, one of the primary indications for subtotal petrosectomy has turned out to be skull base osteomyelitis. Okay, followed by, let's say, tympanomastoid paraganglioma. I've done close to about 40-45 skull base osteomyelitis, and I'm happy with the kind of results I've got with the skull base osteomyelitis. So when you're doing subtotal petrosectomy for a disease like a skull base osteomyelitis, you don't want to be leaving behind any tissue. Now, if it's a tumor, glomus tympanicum, tympanomastoid paraganglioma, yes, you might not need to be so extensive unless the tumor itself is very extensive. Yes, in B3 tumors, sometimes the tumor is very extensive and you have to do this. But if it's a B2 or a limited B3, you don't need to remove all the cells of the sinodural angle and other things. Okay, so if they're healthy, you can leave it alone, no harm done. But in the skull base osteomyelitis, I would like to achieve a picture like this, and most often I end up with a picture like this where all possible cells, in fact, in skull base osteomyelitis, you see the disease going even deeper, okay, past the cochlea into the petrous apex. So all these cells have to be excentrated. Always remove the ossicles, malleus incus, and the suprastructure of the stapes. Okay, the suprastructure of the stapes has to be removed. Okay, the cog area can be drilled out, again depending on the disease extension. Now you see this. This is the suprastructure of the stapes. If you leave behind the suprastructure and then put fat, the fat can tend to cause pressure on the stapes suprastructure, leading to a little bit of vertigo. So a lot of patients in the past, back at Grupo where I studied, and we've learned this out of experience. So now what we do and what I do is to remove the suprastructure, so the fat doesn't really press on this stapes to cause any amount of vertigo. So this is done. Retrofacial tympanotomy, the whole of the hypotympanic bone can be drilled out. Retrofacial tympanotomy can be done to get into deeper parts of the petrous apex. Now, as I told you last time again, so there's a little bit of an overlap. This retrofacial tympanotomy with the canal wall up. Now, this is the canal wall down, but with the canal wall up, retrofacial tympanotomy can be used to drain Petersepes cholesterol granulomas, which are more lateral, and that's a good approach because you're keeping the canal wall intact. You're going from behind. If the jugular bulb is in its position, if it's not a high jugular bulb, and if there is adequate space between the fascia and the jugular bulb, this is a very good approach to the petrous apex, to drain petrous apex cholesterol gland. Not for every disease, okay, not for other diseases, only for PSCGs, because all you have to do in petrous apex cholesterol granulomas is to drain it. You don't have to actually excise the sac completely. So that's the depth to which you can go to doing a subtotal petrosectomy. Now, so this is subtotal petrosectomy. What's the difference between subtotal petrosectomy and a translabyrinthine approach? Now, the first subtotal petrosectomy is the first step to a translabyrinthine approach. But in a subtotal petrosectomy, we are still being fairly conservative. I am not removing the middle fossa dural plate. I'm not removing the sigmoid plate. I'm not trying to do anything with the dura. I'm still trying to be conservative. I'm still trying to preserve the lateral canal. So the mood is organ preservation. So in a subtotal petrosectomy, you're not trying to achieve big things because your middle fossa dural plate, sigmoid sinus plate is not drilled out. And if they're not drilled out, you can't go further deeper into deeper areas. So that's the fundamental difference between the, otherwise it's always the first step to deeper procedures. Now translabyrinthine approach, okay? With the translabyrinthine approach, you will realize that right in the beginning, we go ahead and expose the middle fossa dural plate, sigmoid sinus plate, and all that. There is, the approach is, the mood is not to be conservative, the mood is to be radical, okay? So that's the primary difference. In a subtotal petrosectomy, we are still very much autological. We are still very much radical mastectomy types, you know? So we are not thinking of expanding the craniotomy into a middle fossa and retrosigmoid craniotomy. So the translabyrinthine approach, the history of which has been provided by Kavita, is a fascinating approach. It has a fascinating history, and according to me, it's a truly versatile approach, and it's one of the widest corridors to the cerebellopontine angle. When done properly, and if you follow the techniques that I'm going to describe, it is one of the widest approach. There is no tumor that cannot be removed with a translab bar transaortic, because the transaortic is an extension of the translabyrinthine approach. So the translab transaortic combination, there is practically no tumor of the cerebellopontine angle that can be removed. Now the tumor is going further medially into, let's say, a spinopetroclavian meningioma, which is in the CP angle, you know, going further medially, you can drill the bone further, do a little bit of rerouting and business to get into the more deeper parts of the petrous bone and the prepontine system. But remember that this translabyrinthine approach has a major disadvantage. That is, it destroys hearing. Okay, so the translabyrinthine approach vis-a-vis a retrosigmoid approach has one major disadvantage, that is, it destroys hearing. So it must not be used in tumors with good hearing. Again, there's a lot of discussion. Now we can go, this is another direction. We can talk about small tumors, hearing preservation here, you know, versus radiotherapy, gamma knife. You know, a lot of discussions when it comes to discussing the pathology. That's why I said the more clinical parts of these discussions will be done in future webinars. And please keep following my Facebook page and a few other Facebook pages, which constantly give information regarding future webinars. So we are just dealing with anatomical parts of these approaches. Okay, so the translabyrinthine approach, one is destroys hearing, so it's not a hearing preservation approach, but the compromise is worth because it gives a very wide exposure. So if you have a tumor where the hearing is practically gone, okay, severe to profound hearing loss, then this is a better approach. Okay, what does it involve? So it has a postoral incision. It has a wide postoral incision, the same incision that you saw in the earlier case as subtotal petrosectomy. Then it involves a temporal craniotomy, a canal wall up procedure with a labyrinthectomy. The canal wall down is the canal wall is then brought down in a transaortic approach, but otherwise it is very much a canal wall up procedure followed by labyrinthectomy. Then you do a petrosectomy, that is drill around the labyrinth and then get into the cerebellopontine angle. Okay, So this is the temporal bone. That is the linea temporalis, and all these steps we have discussed before. We do there's a triangle of attack, the 3 incisions of the mastectomy, but then the area of exposure is much wider. Now, this picture, I'm showing you this picture. This is the original translabyrinthine approach described by William House. So I want to first show you the original translabyrinthine approach and then show what is, as Kavita described, the extended, the enlarged translabyrinthine approach. Now, in the original translabyrinthine approach described by Bill House, it began with a fairly enlarged mastectomy, and then the sigmoid sinus is delineated, middle fossa-dural plate is delineated, but you see this posterior edge of bone, very much mastectomy types. Okay, the superior middle fossa-dural plate exposure also is fairly like a routine mastectomy. The canal wall is preserved, lateral semicircular canal is identified, antrum is exposed, antrum is always drilled from the editor's area is drilled from inside out. Use cutting burr of an adequate size, making sure you don't touch the incus, but in this case there is anyway going to be some hearing loss, but in any case always better to stick on to principles. Okay, make it a habit. So you go from inside out, keep the incus bridge, don't do too big what do you call aticotomy, you know. So the epitympanotomy should not be too big, because this area is this pathway here. When you do a CP angle exposure, this is the pathway for CSF leak. Now the TM is intact, yes, but we have an Eustachian tube, so the CSF can go from the CP angle here through the editus into the Eustachian tube. So don't be too aggressive in these areas, okay? Because this has to be later on plugged with periosteum. Now this is not really necessary, okay? This is not really necessary. I'm showing this to say that you do not need to expose the inclumellial joint. This much of exposure is enough for a translabyrinthine approach when you're doing a epitympanotomy, okay? You then go into the other areas, lateral semicircular canal, inclumellial joint, that's the area of the epitympanotomy. You come to your mastectomy, digastric ridge, the facial nerve is then seen. That's the facial nerve. This is the sigmoid sinus, middle fossa-dural plate, all the bone over the sigmoid, a little bit over the retrosigmoid, pre-sigmoid area is completely removed. All the bone over the middle fossa-dural plate is completely removed. The lateral canal, the superior canal, posterior canal is completely delineated. I told you I like this point between the facial nerve, the ampullary end of the posterior semicircular canal, non-ampullary end of the lateral semicircular. I like this point. I always tend to drill it and explore this a little bit to delineate the facial nerve nicely, because if I drill in this area, I am sure that I have hugged the facial nerve all along. Here anyway you can easily hug it, but this is where it gets a little confusing. But staying in this point, I can hug the facial nerve and not leave behind a chunk of bone which will later on impede my vision or exposure of the fundus of the internal notory meatus. This is the subarcuate canal. It's been drilled out. The arch of the superior semicircular canal can be seen nicely. Common crosses here. The ampullary end of the posterior semicircular canal, non-ampullary end of the lateral canal, ampullary of the lateral canal, ampullary end of the superior canal. So this is the labyrinthine block completely delineated. One structure that you see coming from the midpoint of the arch of the posterior semicircular canal is the endolymphatic duct, and this is the endolymphatic sac. Now this has the endolymphatic sac and the duct have to be cut to release the pre-sigmoid dura. Otherwise, there will be an obstruction. So the first step is to do a labyrinthectomy. You go ahead, I've inverted the site of the dissection. Middle fossa-dural plate is exposed, but you see, I want you to note the bony margin of this craniotomy. Sigmoid sinus exposed, but note the bony margin of the craniotomy. Okay, canal wall is intact, facial nerve is exposed almost. I mean, not exposed, I would say skeletonized, not decompressed. Never expose the facial nerve. the lateral superior posterior canals are identified, the jugular bulb is coming into view. Labyrinthectomy is completed. The superior segments are not really completed, but in progress. The ampullary end of superior, ampullary end of lateral, non-ampullary end of lateral, common crus, ampullary end of the posterior canal. So you merge all the ampullary, non-ampullary end into the vestibule. You see this, how the posterior canal, a lot of people make this mistake. They stop at this point and think that they've drilled the posterior canal, but the posterior canal actually makes a loop like this up to the vestibule. If you don't do this, you leave some sensory epithelium, and this can lead to a failure of your labyrinthectomy. This is the vestibule. The entire labyrinthectomy has been completed. You see it's a fairly high jugular bulb. Facial nerve is very nicely skeletonized. We have hugged the facial nerve. That's the saccular and utricular ducts forming the endolymphatic duct. All that is removed. The endolymphatic sac is cut. Presigmoid dura is now complete. There's no bone here. Presigmoid over the sigmoid and a little bit over the retrosigmoid area. Okay. There is bone here at the jugulosigmoid junction. The jugular bulb is very high. Now we are getting into petrosectomy. Now the entire labyrinthectomy is completed. There is a nice thick fat chunk of bone that you'll have to drill to get to the area of the internal auditory meatus. Now this is the vestibule. Always keep the vestibule intact, because you will realize that the IAC comes like this, more or less adjacent to the vestibule. So this is the IAC. You see the internal auditory meatus. Now when you're talking about the internal auditory meatus, you need to know a few important things. Now again, this is the middle fossa dura. Sinodural angle completely delineated, and this structure here, which is not really blue because it's not injected specimen, is the superior petrosal sinus arising from the sigmoid sinus transverse sinus junction and then going along the petrous ridge to the cavernous sinus. Okay, the other petrous sinus is inferior petrosal sinus, which is medial to this jugular bulb, going along the undersurface of the petrous bone into the petroclavial junction fissure and into the cavernous sinus. Now this is the jugular bulb. Internal auditory meatus has come into view. There is some bone between the middle fossa dura. These are all deeper parts of the petrous bone between the middle fossa dura and the upper border of the IAC, and there is some bone between the IAC and the jugular bulb. So all this bone also has to be removed. When you're removing bone inferior to the internal auditory meatus and superior to the jugular bulb, that is between these two structures, you will encounter what is called the cochlear aqueduct. The cochlear aqueduct is comes from the lies adjacent to the subcochlear tunnel and comes from the aortic capsule down and lies medial to the jugular bulb. Okay, so it lies medial to the jugular bulb. This is a very important structure. It needs to be identified, but not always possible to be identified, because this cochlear aqueduct is directly communicating with the posterior cranial fossa, with the CSF of the posterior cranial fossa, and this pathway has CSF in it. Now, when you're doing this procedure in a live patient, you will see that the presigmoid dura will be bulging forward. The middle fossa dura will be bulging downwards. So it won't be so nice and relaxed as you're seeing in a dissection specimen. So this space here, you see, can be achieved primarily by hugging the facial nerve, decompressing the sigmoid, presigmoid, middle fossa dural areas, and by releasing CSF from the posterior fossa. Now, that is why when you drill in this area, you will see this duct which you have to open, and immediately CSF will come out. When CSF comes, middle fossa dura, posterior fossa dura all falls back. There will be relaxation, and you'll actually get this nice space to do your instrumentation. So the next step, when you're delineating the IAC and drilling the bone below the IAC, between the IAC and the jugular bulb, you have to identify the cochlear aqueduct. When you're identifying the cochlear aqueduct, there is another thing that you need to know. Do not go between the cochlear aqueduct and the jugular bulb, okay, too deep. If you go too deep, two things can happen. One is you will tend to damage the inferior petrosal sinus, which also goes along the lower border of the petrous bone. I told you that the inferior petrosal sinus goes around the lower border of the inferior surface of the petrous bone. So one is you may hit the inferior petrosal sinus. The other, more importantly, you may hit the one of the cranial nerves, most importantly, the ninth cranial nerve, which lies just medial to the jugular vein. So if this is the cochlear aqueduct, there is no real need to, you can follow the cochlear aqueduct down, but don't go too close into these areas because this is where there are other important structures. So stay above the cochlear aqueduct between the IAC and the cochlear. You can go as deep as you want. You can completely remove the petrous bone. Now, this is what Kavita was referring to when she said that there is something called transapical extension. Now, the translabyrinthine approach as described by Bill House gave this kind of exposure. The IAC also was delineated something like as it is represented in this picture. So the internal auditory canal in this picture you can see is delineated by about 180 degree. If you take a line along the IAC, you can say that just 180 degree of the IAC has been delineated. Okay. Now this is the whole dissection again all over in a video. I'll just quickly go through it. So we are using I use a even bigger cutting burr. I use a 7 mm cutting burr to get through this step very quickly. There's no nothing that needs to be shown when it comes to a mastectomy. It is fairly straightforward. Is there a problem with the video? Bhargav, are we okay with the video?
Sir, it's a little bit stuck. And your volume is also very low, sir.
Okay, so let me see. Okay, so now we are doing a mastectomy. Once the mastectomy is completed, there's some problem with the video. It's getting stuck. I don't know why. It was working fine when we just tried it out some time back. Let's forget this. Okay, let's get to the next slide. Now, I want to show you the difference between what we just saw, that is the classical Bill House translabyrinthine approach versus an enlarged translabyrinthine approach as proposed by Professor Mario Sana. Now you see that in an enlarged translabyrinthine approach, the incision is fairly larger. Flaps are elevated in the subcutaneous plane and in the musculoperiosteal layers. Mastoid tip is exposed. The posterior exposure is up to the digastric ridge and the emissary veins. Look at the craniotomy. The middle fossa dura is exposed up to 3 to 4 centimeters above, and the retrosigmoid area is also exposed about 3 centimeters posterior to the sigmoid sinus. In the previous dissection, I told you to observe the craniotomy. It was something like this, isn't it? It was just this much. Now we have added this extra bone removal on the middle fossa and the posterior fossa dural plates. By doing so, by removing bone, you are now able to expose more dura. And when you're exposing more dura, by your instrumentation, you're holding the suction tip on the left hand and the drill on the right hand, and just with your instrumentation, you're able to push this dura backwards. Now, if there was bone, that small craniotomy, if that was bone, the bone would not allow you to push. So always remember that if you want to go deeper, if you want to go more medial, more anterior into the skull base, have a wide lateral exposure. This is fundamental. Okay, so that's the reason. So what does this approach do? This approach tries to give you that additional exposure that you lacked in your previous slide. Okay, so in this exposure, whatever you do, you will not be able to go much beyond this because now you have the bony boundaries. Okay, you might remove soft tissue, but it's like going into a tunnel. If the entry of the tunnel is small, no point going into the tunnel and making it wide because you'll never fit inside anyway. Okay, so you have to have a wide lateral exposure. What happened? Presentation is stuck again. Okay, so now again we go through the steps. Lateral canal, supracanal, posterior canal, endolymphatic sac is cut. That's the saccular utricular duct and the endolymphatic duct becoming the endolymphatic sac that is cut using a beaver knife, and that is when the entire now you look at the IAC exposure. The earlier IAC exposure was to about 180 degree. In the enlarged translabyrinthine approach, there is always a 270 degree exposure. Okay, and in type 1, you go even more around the IAC up to 320 degrees. In type 2, you go all around 360 degrees. You can do whatever you want because you now have a wide lateral exposure. You can go with the instrumentation and drill. Otherwise, you would have had a smaller approach. You would not have had space to do this transapical extension. So you need to. So in this case, we have done like a type 2. Type 1 transapical extension. It's about 320 degree and 360 degrees going all around the IAC. The cochlear aqueduct is nicely seen. You will now appreciate the dome of the jugular bulb and this thin blue line that you're seeing, that is the infrapetrosal sinus. Just medial in this bony triangle here between the jugular bulb, cochlear aqueduct and the infrapetrosal sinus is where the lower cranial nerves, the 9th, 10th and the 11th cranial nerve, which go into the neural compartment. I described the entire jugular bulb anatomy in the last webinar, and I told you that the jugular foramen has a vascular component, posterolateral vascular component, anteromedial neural compartment, isn't it? So all that is here, and if you don't want to be getting into these areas, jugular bulb, this area is not necessary to be drilled because you anyway have the jugular bulb obstructing, so anything posterior is unnecessary to be drilled. Now you're all ready to open the IAC. How do you open the IAC? Always identify the superior ampullary nerve. Again, there is a detour from the the Billhouse technique of identifying the facial nerve. The Billhouse technique was to go superior anteriorly, identify the labyrinthine section, identify the Bill's bar, identify the facial nerve, go catch the bull by its horns, go by the to the facial, and then go stay in front of the facial, pluck the superior ampullary superior vestibular nerve complex and come down. That's great because in Billhouse's hands and in somebody as proficient in skull base surgery in the facial nerve as Billhouse could do it. And for those of those otologists, skull base surgeons who are extremely experienced, it is okay. You can still go ahead and catch the bull by its horns. But for some people or for the beginners, or you can always make it a habit. You don't really need to go and identify the labyrinthine section of the facial because no tumor goes into these areas. Okay, unless it's a facial nerve tumor. So if it is, you can always make a habit of identifying the facial nerve in another way. Okay, so what you do is you identify the superior ampullary, for which you have to leave behind a shadow of the ampullary into the superior semicircular canal. You will leave behind the ampullary into the superior semicircular canal. From there, you can trace the superior ampullary nerve downwards, which eventually becomes the superior vestibular nerve, and then the superior vestibular nerve can be separated from the facial nerve. Now, this is what I said. The Bill's bar technique, Billhouse's technique involved going like this, and then plucking the superior vestibular nerve. We go pluck the superior vestibular nerve, then we see the Bill's bar. We do not remove so much bone. Here you can see the shadow of the labyrinthine section, but we do not remove so much bone. We leave behind some bone here. So just by plucking this out and identifying the Bill's bar, you will see the facial nerve behind it. And this is a sure shot way of not injuring the facial nerve. Obviously, all this is done with using a facial nerve monitor. The superior vestibular, inferior vestibular nerves are brought down. Behind that will be the facial nerve and the cochlear nerve. So you bring down these two nerves, and behind that you'll have two other nerves. The facial nerve is here, the cochlear nerve is here. Once you have identified the tumor will be sitting here. And once you've opened, the last thing you should do is to open the dura. Because once you open the dura, the CSF will come. Of course, when you open the IAC, also CSF will come, but it won't be such a big gush. But when you open the cerebellopontine angle, that's when you can no longer drill, because when you drill, you will be seeding bone dust into the CP angle, which is not really a wise thing to do. So finish off all your drilling, especially the transapical extension, especially the areas of jugular bulb, facial nerve, middle fossa, posterior fossa, before you get into the CP angle. When you get into the CP angle, it looks like this. The cochlear nerve may be preserved if you're doing a cochlear implantation. I just lost my power here. I hope it will come in a second. I'll continue the lecture. Bhargav, can you hear me? Is the internet on?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll go ahead with the lecture. Okay, so the facial nerve can be seen. The cochlear nerve can be preserved in smaller tumors, but in smaller tumors, generally you have good hearing, and when the hearing is good, you don't do a translabyrinthine approach, right? So, but yes, if you want to use, there is still a possibility of using a translabyrinthine approach and hearing preservation by putting in a cochlear implant. Okay, that's another. That's what, there are a lot of issues here, decision making. We are not getting into those things. I'm telling you, we are legions away from the clinical aspects of skull base. Okay, we're just dealing with anatomical aspects here. Okay, we'll come to. So what can be done? One is to do a translab in a tumor where there's no hearing. The other thing is to do a translab, preserve the cochlear nerve in a small tumor, and then do a cochlear implant. That's also a possibility. Why, when, how? Why not do a retrosigmoid? Why? All that we'll discuss another day. Okay, so cochlear nerve can be preserved or can be removed. Now you can see here in the CP angle proper. You see such a wide exposure. You can put your hand, foot, and everything else, your whole head into this area. It's so widely exposed. Why would you choose not to adapt or adopt this approach to removing any tumor of the cerebellopontine angle? Not only vestibular schwannomas, but also meningiomas, epidermoids, anything, because it gives a very wide exposure. You do not have to worry about the brainstem. You do not have to worry about bleeding. Whatever happens, it can be controlled. It's like open surgery. Okay, whereas in the retrosigmoid, things can get tricky because it's a narrower approach, and in a big tumor, it can get a little difficult if things don't go according to plan. Now, this is the Dandy's vein. The fifth cranial nerve is coming into view. The artery that's generally hugging the fifth cranial nerve is the superior cerebellar artery. Artery that's hugging the icosticofascial bundle is the ICA, that's anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Both the ICA and the SCA come from the basilar artery, and the basilar artery deep down is formed by the fusion of the two vertebral arteries. The lower cranial nerves, I told you, come from a separate neural compartment of the jugular bulb. The medial wall of the jugular bulb sits on two nerves, that's the 10th and the 11th. The 9th cranial nerve has a separate small other compartment along with the inferior petrosal sinus, and the two of them are separated by the jugular spine. Now, all this we discussed in our last webinar, isn't it? So the lower cranial nerves are here. Now, can anybody tell me what this is? Okay, so this is again discussed in my last webinar. This is the jugular tubercle. Okay, the importance of it is more in lower lesions, in infratemporal fossa lesions, foramen magnum lesions. So not so much important now, but remember that medial to this is the hypoglossal canal, and more medial to it and inferior to it is the foramen magnum. So this is the view that you get. Here you see the ICA very clearly, the pons is here, the choroid plexus here, cerebellum is here, the flocculus choroid plexus complex, posteriorly cerebellum, pons anteriorly, that's why it's called the cerebellopontine angle, inferiorly of the medulla and the pontomedullary junction. Jugular tubercle can be seen. This is your transapical extension. If you do a complete, now this is more or less a 360-degree transapical extension. Here you can go and see you are more or less in the prepontine cistern. You are seeing the sixth cranial nerve entering the Dorello's canal. Okay, if you tilt this superiorly, you see the fifth cranial nerve. The sensory neuron rootlets are generally thicker. The motor rootlets are generally thinner. There are always two rootlets to the fifth cranial nerve. The Dandy's vein is fairly this thing. And if you reflect the tentorium attaches itself to the petrous ridge, but the petrous ridge is removed here, isn't it? Completely drilled out from lateral to medial. So if you push the tentorium, you see the posterior cerebral artery. Okay, and the fourth cranial nerve can be seen by reflecting the tentorium. So that's about the translabyrinthine approach. Now, what is transaortic approach? Okay, transaortic approach. Transaortic approach is an extension of the translabyrinthine approach. If you are not happy with this exposure, okay, let's say you have some tumor that is going into these areas in the prepontine cistern, into the jugular tubercle area. You need further exposure. You need to remove this bone. Now it's very, very difficult because posteriorly your craniotomy is already done. So you can't keep going like this. So you have to come from above. Okay, what do? You do what is called the transaortic approach. In this approach, you remove the complete aortic capsule completely anterior to the fascial nerve. So we'll begin with the translab. I told you all bony drilling is done before dural exposure. So I'm going back to a situation where the dura is intact. Okay, the jugular bulb is fairly high. The facial canal is kept intact. Remember, in a transaortic approach, the facial nerve is kept inside its fallopian canal, but the drilling is done in such a way that the fallopian canal is completely skeletonized but not decompressed. The facial nerve is never decompressed. Okay, the canal is kept intact, thereby preserving the function of the facial nerve in toto. Okay, so now what you do, you've done a translab, you go ahead, start drilling out the aortic capsule anteriorly, that is the cochlea. Okay, this oval window, everything goes off. Here you can go on drilling till the carotid anterior. Okay, till the carotid anterior. No point in drilling more because your intention is get into the CP angle, not in the infratemporal fossa. If you take out this anterior piece of bone, you will get into the infratemporal fossa, which is a different territory. We are not dealing with it today. We are trying to get into the CP angle. There could be a situation where the CP angle tumor extends in the infratemporal fossa, which is where transcochlear approach comes, which is where you have to do exactly what I said you should not do now. That is to get into the infratemporal fossa. So there is a reason for everything. An approach has a logic to it. So in this case, a transaortic approach is used for pure infratemporal CP angle tumors, but with anterior and more medial extensions into the prepontine system. So now what do? You remove the, drill out the, so facial nerve is preserved. You see, you can drill out in the beginning itself and delineate or skeletonize or decompress the internal carotid artery, which is not really necessary. Just for those of you who are confident, you can decompress. For those of you who are not, you can just skeletonize and leave it, because we are not going to go anterior to this. Everything will be posterior. That's the area of the carotid artery. Carotid artery in this case is decompressed, not just skeletonized. There is no bone over the carotid, but not really necessary to do that. What's more important for you to understand is that the facial nerve is entirely in its canal. No part of the facial nerve is visible till you get inside the CP angle. Now, this kind of drilling. Now, what you see here is that the drill is going anterior to the facial nerve, coming posteriorly. Okay, into these areas. Do not drill like that. That's a wrong way of drilling. Always go under the facial nerve. Do not come from anterior, because in a snap, you can fracture the facial nerve, fallopian canal. If you do this and your drill slips, now what you're doing is coming posteriorly from anterior. If your drill slips, this is not a natural direction, you can fracture the fallopian canal. Once you fracture the fallopian canal, your facial nerve is gone, cut, because then you can't decompress it. Better than that would be to decompress and reroute the facial nerve posteriorly. Over a period of a few months, the nerve will recover. But if you cut the fallopian canal, then you're finished. You have a grade 3 for sure, if not a grade 4 later on. Okay, so this is a wrong way of drilling. Drill from posterior. Okay, open up the entire cerebellopontine angle. Now you can go up to the clivus. This is the ascending petrous carotid, genu, horizontal petrous carotid, posterior to the carotid and anterior to the facial nerve. You can go drill the entire optic capsule and much more of the petrous bone till the clivus. Okay, till the clivus. So that is what you achieve with the transaortic approach. This part of the facial nerve is exposed because this is the part of the facial nerve inside the cerebellopontine angle. So this is the fundus and this is the porus of the cerebellum. This is the CP angle compartment of the facial nerve. This anatomy again is similar to the anatomy that I showed you before. But now what you have achieved by this transaortic approach is you have removed the entire posterior canal wall. So there is no shadow of the posterior canal wall into your areas posteriorly, and that can happen. That can be a serious limitation. Just the fact that the posterior canal wall exists may put a shadow when you tilt the microscope and make this whole area dark. This area that you see dark can happen is much more darker with the canal intact. So now with the with this area open, the light can pass through this, and all these prepontine areas up to the clivus can be well illuminated and exposed. Okay, so if you have that huge acoustic neuroma, vestibular schwannoma, prepontine cyst, don't bother, do a blind sec. Yes. Now in this, one thing is, if you are shifting to a transaortic, you have to do a blind sec closure. Blind sec closure is not necessary in a translabyrinthine. So that is another 1 hour of work. Do a blind sec closure, get exposure. Huge meningiomas, 4-5 centimeter tumors can be easily removed with facial nerve preservation in using a transaortic approach. Now, what is a transcochlear approach? And that's what we'll be dealing with: translab, transaortic, and transcochlear. If time permits, I'll do a brief run on the middle force approaches. Okay, so before that, I think I need a little bit of a break. My lips are quivering. So I would ask Bhargav if it's okay to take a few questions by the time, I settle down a little bit, because this is the next half of the presentation, the transcochlear approaches. So Bhargav, can we take some questions to just help me get a break?
Sir, I'll list out the question, sir.
Yeah.
There was one question. What is the proximal limit of facial nerve exposure for posterior rerouting of the facial nerve?
See, now all questions regarding posterior rerouting of the facial nerve, I will answer after transcochlear approaches, because that's something I've not covered so far. Okay, so we'll skip that question, but it's a very important question. I like the question, but only thing is, no point in talking about something that I've not taught so far. Okay, so I just we'll keep that question to probably after the second half of the presentation. Anything else?
So what is the indication of surgery in malignant otitis externa? I mean, skull base.
So that's a huge topic. Okay, so now one of my thesis students is doing a work on that, and retrospectively analyzing close to 40 cases. Malignant otitis externa. Now we have to differentiate two things: osteitis and osteomyelitis. Malignant otitis externa, I would not like to use the word malignant, but I understand what the person asking the question means. I'm sure what he or she means is skull base osteomyelitis. Yes. I would rather start using the word skull base osteomyelitis. Malignant otitis externa, for multiple reasons, is a misnomer. It is neither malignant, neither otitis externa. Okay, but if you're saying, if it's otitis externa, limited to the external auditory meatus or the middle ear, okay, and so-called malignant because it is pseudomonas and diabetic and all that, then you don't need a skull base approach. You can probably go for antibiotics, probably do a little bit of debridement, even a canal wall down mastectomy limited, and see what happens. But when we are talking about skull base osteomyelitis, which is what we see in our practice, and a lot of patients end up with suboptimal treatment, because it's a big topic by itself. It requires another 1 hour of discussion, but I'll try to briefly tell. Now, if there is disease, and I told you close to 40 cases, going deep into the petrous areas, deep into all these areas, then one needs to definitely, I'm convinced beyond a shadow of doubt that a skull base approach, subtotal, I would like to call it subtotal petrous, but can end up with a transaortic, end up with whatever, because you keep going deeper and deeper and you just follow the disease. It's not like a round laddu for which you can plan. Yes, there is a certain amount of planning involved, but you follow the disease. And when you go inside, you'll see that a lot of disease can also be in the infratemporal fossa. It can be in the areas of stylomastoid foramen. It can be going along the anterior, along the eustachian tube, and then into the petrous areas, hypotympanum, posterior to the facial or retrofacial areas. So all these areas cannot be opened and left open. I get a lot of people arguing with me saying that, see, why don't we leave the cavity open, because we don't know what happens inside when you close the subtotal petrosectomy. My answer is for that is that if you're doing a subtotal petrosectomy, blind side closure, eustachian tube closure, you have all the time and place in the world to remove every bit of disease. If you remove at least 80% of the disease, the remaining 20% can be managed with IV antibiotic. I have a protocol, 3 weeks IV, 3 months oral antibiotics. So all that, the remaining 20% can take care, even if you leave behind disease. But if you, in most of the cases, you can remove significant amount, 80, 90, 100% of the disease. Okay, and when you remove 100% of the disease, close the cavity, come off. But you should be sure that you've removed at least 80% of the disease. if you remove 60, 50, 40, 30% of the disease, this disease is going to blow. Then if you do a blind site closure, you've had shit hitting the ceiling. Okay, so if you are capable of doing a skull-based approach, like how I showed you in these pictures, follow the disease extensively, remove more than 80%, leaving behind probably a little bit of thing in the petrous apex clivus. Don't worry, those things will either get absorbed when they're because when you're going in, you're also ventilating those areas. It's not just disease clearance, isn't it? The granulation might not be contaminated with bacteria. It could just be granulation due to lack of ventilation because of so much disease. So when it's like a decompression, it's like an abscess drainage. What happens? A lot of times you remove the abscess and abscess heals by itself. You don't have to even, debride and remove the abscess cavity itself. You just open the pus, the fever comes down, symptoms come down. Similarly, when you go inside, remove the disease, the bone, the dura is a much tougher barrier to infection than the bone. When it comes to skull-based osteomyelitis and extensive bony infiltration of disease, the bone acts poorer than the dura. The dura, because the next question would be, what about meningitis? If that never happens. Okay, the dura never happened with me. 40 cases. I've not seen a single meningitis. Okay, so except one case, which there was a patient who died of the consequences. But that's what it's a long story. We have to. This is a different topic altogether. That was in a patient who was operated, who had low cranial paralysis, probably an episode of meningitis because he was sick for some time. So that's a different story. But if you're telling me that the dura can be the next thing involved, no, it doesn't happen. If you clear the bone, you will have very good clearance with which did not give me any rest. So I was continuously speaking. Okay, so I'll just quickly have a glass of water and I'll come back to you. Okay, you can probably collect the questions.
Okay.
Okay, shall we move on or another question? What?
We'll move on, sir. We'll take the questions at the end.
Okay, so now what we are going to discuss from now on are the transcochlear approaches. Now this is a little complicated, but not really impossible to understand because we are taking you in a stepwise fashion. We have described translabyrinthine, transaortic, and then we are moving further deeper into the skull-based territory. So now the transcochlear approach means that you're not happy with transaortic. You're not happy, obviously not happy with translabyrinthine. There's a posterior canal wall. You removed that. You have the facial nerve between you and the tumor, and you're not happy with that exposure as well. You need more exposure, wider exposure of the cerebellopontine angle. So what do? Obviously, such tumors which are so big, hearing is not a concern because hearing would have gone for a toss anyway. We're talking about huge posterior petrous phase meningiomas, posterior fossa meningiomas, spinopetroclavian meningiomas, where the hearing is compromised. So in that case, how will you employ a transtemporal approach? You have to drill into more deeper areas, but now you have the facial nerve standing in your way. Remember the transaortic approach picture, you have the facial nerve standing in the way. So you can't go further without actually getting the facial nerve out of your way. So the only way to achieve that is by rerouting the facial nerve, either anterior or posterior. Okay, most commonly posterior rerouting of the facial nerve. So this is used for petroclavian meningiomas, huge residual vestibular schwannomas where you left the tumor further medially, and it involves combining and enlarging of the traditional transcochlear approach and the transaortic. House described the transcochlear approaches. Transaortic approach as described by House, and addition of the infratemporal fossa approach. So it's a little bit of everything, but still the focus is the pathway or the point of what do you say, where the journey ends is still the CP angle only. Okay, we're not talking about going into other. So we have 4 types of modified transcochlear, because the transcochlear approach was initially described by House. There's been a lot of changes to what was mentioned before. So the modified transcochlear approach can be done type A, B, C, and D. Type A involves simple rerouting of the facial nerve posteriorly. It is a transotic with a posterior rerouting. Now see this picture. This is Professor Mario Sarna's from his book, and you can see very clearly the extent of one. It's one of the widest exposures in among transtemporal approaches. So this approach here that you can see, the red boundary, is the traditional transcochlear approach, which is nothing but transotic with a facial nerve rerouting. Now, if you want to go further anteriorly and include the infratemporal fossa areas, that is called type B. Type C I will tell later. Type D is when you go posteriorly and get into the occipital condyle area, far lateral, and the suboccipital areas. That's called type D. Type C, so okay, come again, type A, type B, type D. Now type C is an extension of type A where you go transtentorial. I showed you the tentorium earlier, no? Now you go transtentorial, that itself becomes type C. So you have type A and C here, but bony removal doesn't change in type C. Bony removal is still the same as type A. Type B, additional bony removal anteriorly. Type D, additional bone removal posteriorly and inferiorly. Type C is just a soft tissue extension, that is transtentorial extension. So now this is transotic. Transotic, after transotic, the next step is rerouting of the facial nerve posteriorly. Okay, rest of the things remain the same. Okay, now you see the space that you get. This was where the facial nerve was. You put it back gently. There are a lot of small miniature points, lot of small issues that we have to discuss, but that's for, I told you, another day. You can't learn the entire skull base in one webinar. Okay, so we are now rerouting the facial nerve. I'm just teaching you concepts. We are rerouting the facial nerve posteriorly, and we are getting space additionally. Now you see this whole area is up for grabs. Okay, this whole area is up for grabs. So now you reroute it posteriorly, start drilling the aortic capsule, and this is the cochlea. You can see the relationship of the cochlea to the facial nerve. Okay, this is the superior and inferior vestibular nerve. The facial nerve was like this. It was like this. I will also change my pointer. Somebody had told me that the pointer that I use is not visible, but I don't seem to be having a pointer option. Okay, there's a pointer. Okay, so now you see. So the facial nerve was like this and going down like this, but now it's been rerouted posterior. So you see the cochlea coming out of the modulus, and then you see the vestibular nerve. Now all this is drilled out, completely drilled out. Okay, again cochlea, you can clearly see the scala tympani, scala vestibuli, basal turn, middle turn, apical turn of the cochlea. Cochlear nerve is beautifully seen. It's a very thick nerve. The cochlear nerve is the thickest nerve of all the 4 nerves in the acousticofacial bundle. So once the nerve, now you see that the nerve has been pushed back. Okay, so this is the facial nerve pushed back. This whole thing is a facial nerve posteriorly rerouted. You get complete and excellent control of the prepontine cistern area. This is the 4th cranial nerve. Pons is here. 5th cranial nerve is here. Okay, this could be the ICA. This is not injected specimen, difficult to say, but I think this is the ICA, labyrinthine arteries and the ICA coming from it. The flocculus is here. Lower cranial nerves are here. Okay, the 9th cranial nerve, 10th cranial nerve can be seen. Now the nerve can either be pushed anteriorly, pushed posteriorly. See, it's flexible, it's moving. So we can move it around to remove, access different areas of the cerebellopontine angle. The clivus is here, carotid has been drilled out. This is the petrous area. The entire petrous bone has been removed. Almost every bit of the temporal bone has been removed. Okay, and this is the facial nerve here, put back in its position, but it's not in its fallopian canal, it's dangling in midair. This is the vestibular nerve, vestibular cochlear nerve, the 8th nerve. This is the 7th nerve. Okay, the flocculus is here. The pica, I think this could be the pica. This is the 9th, the 10th cranial nerve. The cerebellum is here, and the pons is here, and this is the 4th cranial nerve. Here, deep down, you can see the basilar artery. Entire prepontine system can be nicely seen. Now, this is again a slightly tilted view. You can see the 5th cranial nerve. This is the basilar artery. You can see the 6th cranial nerve going into the Dorillos canal. Facial is again here. The ICA is here again. Now you can see that the facial is pushed back, and you can actually see the ICA coming out of the basilar artery. This is the basilar artery, one big trunk. The basilar artery is here. 5th cranial nerve is here. 6th is here, and these are the two vertebral arteries: contralateral, ipsilateral vertebral arteries. Okay, so this is again the 6th cranial nerve. So this is all very clearly seen in a transcochlear approach only because you've rerouted the facial nerve. Now, what is the price to pay? Rerouting the facial nerve means that the strength of the nerve comes down. You have knocked off one of the most important arterial supplies, that is the arterial supply, the petrosal branch coming from the middle meningeal artery. That supplies the facial. The facial nerve has 3 branches. One is the stylomastid branch, petrosal branch, and the ICA, isn't it? So the petrosal branch, which comes from the middle meningeal artery, is cut. So this patient may end up, or is most likely to end up with a facial nerve paralysis. But it will be a small price to pay if you can achieve a total removal of a, let's say, a very big, massive sphenopetroclival meningioma. Okay, because most of these tumors are very difficult to, it's very difficult to achieve total removal in most of these tumors. Again, you see the 6th cranial nerve, you see the basilar artery, and you see the ICA coming out of the basilar artery. Now we are moving to the transcochlear approach type B. Type B, we are going into more anterior territory. Okay, now this kind of overlaps with the infratemporal fossa territory. Unfortunately, in my last webinar on infratemporal fossa, we could not finish type B, C, and all that. If we had finished type B, probably this would have made more sense. We stopped at type A and we didn't have much time. But anyway, let's try to make sense of type transcochlear approach type B. And then type C, I said, is superior. Type D is posterior inferior. Now type A is the original transcochlear. Type B is anterior extension. Now you see, this is transcochlear approach. Facial nerve rerouted posteriorly, middle fossa sigmoid sinus. Carotid completely drilled out. So there is no temporal bone, no petrous bone. We are in the CP angle here, okay? But we want more additional exposure. How do you achieve that? You do a small mini subtemporal craniotomy. Do a subtemporal craniotomy. Now you can go along the middle fossa dura. You can follow the middle fossa dura and get into this wedge of bone between the condyle of the mandible and the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so this greater wing of sphenoid now and the tympanic bone, everything is drilled out. As you drill out, as you go along the greater wing of sphenoid, you get into the middle meningeal artery, the foramen spinosum, and you get into V3, that is the foramen ovale. So you see the entire petrous bone. This is the clivus here, the bone around the petrous ICA, the part of the intracarotid artery inside the petrous bone. This is the vertical portion, horizontal portion of the ICA, is all drilled out. Now you're drilling the sphenoid bone. You've drilled out the other parts of the sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid. You're drilling out the foramen spinosum to expose the middle meningeal artery. There'll be a venous plexus. It's not so neat and clean in live surgery. Then you get into the foramen ovale, which transmits the V3, the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. Just medial to that is the pterygoid wedge of the pterygoid plate. So this is the pterygoid plate, which is also a part of the greater wing of sphenoid. So now we have come to almost very close to the nasopharynx. Eustachian tube is here. Just for your reference, you pushed it down. Now we are merging the infratemporal fossa territory with the CP angle territory, isn't it? Okay, suppose there's a tumor in these areas. How do you remove this? So this is how you do it. This is the clivus. Clivus, now we're approaching the clivus directly from posteriorly CP angle and also from the infratemporal fossa anteriorly. What lies above and medial to the pterygoid plates? Now, this is a little confusing. Again, my intention is to give you an overview and not really to teach you skull base surgery in one day. So the base of the pterygoid has the median nerve, which is from the GSP and lesser petrosal forms the median nerve, goes into the median canal. So if you drill this pterygoid plate, you will get it in the nasopharynx. On the upper surface, in the intracranial cavity, now we've retracted the brain. Intracranial cavity, the next foramen along the greater venous sphenoid is the V2 foramen rotunda. What is happening in the petrous area? We have drilled the carotid right up to the foramen lacerum. This is the petrolingual ligament. We have also followed the clivus and drilled the spinopetroclival junction and exposed the paraclival part of the carotid. So this is the clivus. So this is the paraclival part of the carotid. This goes into the cavernous carotid. So we are now following a transtemporal route into the cavernous sinus, nasopharynx, and all these areas. So now, if you drill this area between the V2, between the carotid, V2, and the median, you get into the sphenoid sinus. So median is here, carotid is here, superiorly there is a V2, that you get into the sphenoid sinus. So V2 is here, median is here, carotid is here, sphenoid sinus. If you go under the median now, we get into the nasopharynx. Okay, this is the pterygopalatine fissure. Now we have gone, you have merged the infratemporal fossa with the CP angle. And through the spinopetroclival junction, you have removed the spinopetroclival junction. Now if you cut the V2, and in spinopetroclival meningiomas, the V2 could already be involved. So no, you would probably be allowed to cut it. You can go further higher into actually the cavernous, closer to the cavernous areas. So this is the loop of the cavernous carotid. You're seeing the 6th cranial nerve V1. Meckel's cave is here. Okay. Anteroclinoid process here. Supraorbital fissure is here. And the entire cavernous area is contacted. Okay. Sphenoid. The entire spinopetroclival junction is completely eliminated except for a part of the clivus. Inferior petrosal sinus can be seen here going into the cavernous sinus and all these areas. So this is transcochlear type A. This is optic nerve. This is the loop of the cavernous carotid, supraorbital fissure, the 6th, 3rd cranial nerve, 6th cranial. So all this is again anatomy of the supraorbital fissure area, cavernous sinus area. We leave it for another day. Okay, we are not going to go back. So now we went anterior here, isn't it? We went anterior. Okay, that was type B. Now, if we go transtentorially, for which we'll have to cut the superior petrosal sinus that goes along the tentorial margin, we can get into the more to the middle fossa aspects of the cranium. Okay, so what are the structures you can see? If there is a tumor, that again meningiomas go along the meninges, isn't it? The dura. So it doesn't limit itself to posterior fossa, middle fossa. So it can cross and go into multiple areas, and this is when you need to follow it by pulling the tentorium up and transecting the superior petrosal sinus. So again, right side, we have done a transcochlear approach. Facial nerve is rerouted posteriorly. Jugular bulb is here. Right side again, I repeat, this is the carotid, petrous carotid. Clivus completely drilled out. I'm not doing a type B. I'm not going anteriorly. This is still type A. And I told you type C is an extension of A superiorly. The trigeminal nerve is here, Dandy's vein and all are here. Okay, so this is the root antirism of the facial nerve. Now my area of interest is to cut the superior petrosal sinus, controlled fashion, and expose the middle fossa dural contents. The most important structures that you see, posterior cerebral artery, the 4th cranial nerve, all these structures can be seen in the middle fossa, and this allows exposure of the middle cranial fossa. Again, I don't want to go into too deep anatomy of the middle fossa areas because that again is another day's work. Okay, but remember that you have gone superiorly in type C. So I finished type A, I finished type B, I went anteriorly. In type C, I went superiorly above the tentorium. The middle of this thing, you can see the trigeminal nerve in all its glory. See the posterior cerebral artery, 4th cranial nerve, the 7th cranial nerve, jugular bulb, and the prepontine system is all up for grabs. Okay, huge exposure. Now the last thing is type D. Where is type D focused? It is focused on this area, the jugular bulb area. That's the only part that has not been connected. We have connected the infratemporal fossa, we have connected the middle fossa to the CP angle. Now the only thing that is remaining to be connected into the CP angle is the suboccipital areas. So you can merge that as well into the CP angle. Now this is called a type D. Okay, so again, this is all type C. You can see the sixth cranial nerve getting into the Dorellos canal. Clivus is here. This is the prepontine cistern. Okay. Now we go into type D. Type D is a little bit of what I explained yesterday in the a couple of days back in the infratemporal fossa approach. So add the infratemporal part into, but without the rerouting or with the rerouting. It depends. Whatever you want to do. You have the liberty. I told you either anterior or posterior rerouting of the facial nerve. Now this is the neck part. We are going down. Right side again. Digastric muscle. Okay. Internal jugular vein. The 11th cranial nerve. Okay. So this is the suboccipital area. We are palpating the transverse process of C1. The internal jugular vein is just anterior transverse of C1. 11th cranial nerve is here. Digastric muscle is here. Once you cut all that, similar to the steps that I mentioned a couple of days back, you can then drill the jugular process to reach the jugular tubercle. All this last class, whatever we discussed in the last class, jugular tubercle. This is the sigmoid sinus. Okay, this is the transcochlear approach you've done. Carotid is here. This is the cochlea, sigmoid sinus. Cochlea is all gone. This is the jugular bulb. Okay, sigmoid internal jugular vein here.
This came back from a search.
Okay, so now you have drilled the portion, the occipital bone along the jugular process up to the occipital condyle, medial to which is the foramen magnum. So this is now the hypoglossal canal. You must recollect what I have described earlier. This is the hypoglossal canal with the venous plexus. This is the jugular tubercle. This is the occipital condyle, probably drilled up to at least 50%. I don't want to go, as I told you, again, concepts as to how to deal with occipital condyle. And then you can expose the dura. You can incise this dura completely to expose the CP angle contents. Again, this is transcochlear because the facial nerve has been rerouted. Here you can see the lower cranial nerves. You have incised the dura, pre-sigmoid. Okay, and you can also transect this sigmoid and do what is called the POTS, petroccipital transsigmoid approach, and get into this cerebellopontine angle. Again, 9th cranial nerve, jugular tubercle. The 10th is here, the 11th is here. The first one, I think this is the 9th. 10th is this bunch, 11th is here, 12th cranial nerve is here. This is the pica, loop of the pica. So this must be the vertebral artery. And so this is the lower part of the cerebellopontine angle exposed. Again, you see the two rootlets of the 12th cranial nerve, the origin of the pica from the vertebral artery can all be seen as again prepontine cistern. The jugular tubercle is here. Medial to that is, this is all the area of the foramen magnum again. So this is all that in one specimen. Okay, we have removed. So what have we done here? This part is what we had done earlier. We had done a transcochlear type A. Then we went down, that is into these areas. This is transcochlear type D. In this specimen, we can see the lower parts of the cerebellopontine angle. We can see the jugular bulb exposed. Here, the jugular bulb has been removed. Okay, so you can see the jugular tubercle. You can see the hypoglossal nerve. You can see the two rootlets 1 and 2 forming the hypoglossal nerve, going like this, going down into the neck. This is the occipital condyle. Medial to this is the foramen magnum. And if you dissect in these areas, you will get the vertebral artery also. That is to be kept for another day. Bhargav, I think we'll stop here. We'll not go ahead with the middle fossa approach. We'll keep it for another day. Isn't it
Yes, sir.
too long already?
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. So this is type D. So we finished transcochlear type D. Okay. So too much of information is also too bad. I don't think you will take home anything if you are overburdened with information. So let's stop here, take some questions and wind this webinar.
Yes, sir. Continuing from the older question, older list, sir. Are the retrofacial cells removed in subtotal petrosectomy?
Retrofacial cells, I try to remove, especially I told you, for me, the main indication for subtotal petrosectomy today is for me skull base osteomyelitis. I most definitely remove it. In case of a glomus tympanicum, or what is technically correctly called as tympanomastoid paragangliomas, I would not fully remove it if there is no tumor in the retrofacial areas, and if it's nicely limited to the hypotympanum and all that. But a lot of times I end up removing the retrofacial cells also in a tympanomastoid paraganglioma. It depends on the disease and the indication. Okay, it's not mandatory to remove it. It's not like subtotal pituitary is equal to removal of retrofacial cells. That is definitely not true. But yes, you have to be prepared to remove it.
Sir, then where do you start the drilling for the carotid in front of the cochlea?
The carotid drilling begins. Now there are two things here. If you are doing a carotid exposure, okay, if you're doing a carotid exposure, that is not the same as controlling the carotid. Okay. Now you look at this picture here. Okay, so now this is the cochlea, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Now what has been done here is that the entire hypotympanic bone has been removed, which is a part of the tympanic bone, isn't it? Carotid is in the petrous bone. So this is all petrous. So I prefer identifying the carotid in the area where it is the safest, that is in the hypotympanic area. So I then identify this, and then I go here, and once I delineate the space between the carotid and the cochlea, then I go medial to the cochlea and I create space here also. Okay, making sure that the apical turn, middle turn of the cochlea is not damaged. Okay, and then you can go all around the carotid. You can transpose the carotid, and I've done that in several cases. Now, if you want to do all that playing around the carotid, then you have to remove this entire tympanic bone. You cannot mess around with the carotid like this. This picture here is anatomical description for you to just know where your carotid is. And if most of your work is posterior to the carotid in the CP angle, then this is good. But exposing the carotid is not equal to controlling the carotid. If you want to work with the carotid, then you have to remove this anterior canal, anterior wall of the tympanic bone. Okay, then you will be able to go anterior to the carotid fossa and get control over the carotid. Okay, this is useless. This exposure is practically useless. It's just an anatomical exposure.
Yes, sir. Dr. Mohammed, he was asking, how do you prevent accidental fracture of the facial nerve bony canal while drilling?
Yes, good question. Now, for that, it is important that you keep some bone underneath. See, don't do your retrofacial drilling in the beginning. Do that towards the end. Get on top of the facial nerve, come close, hug it. If it's a transaortic approach that you're planning, keep the fallopian canal thick. Okay, about a couple of millimeters of bone on the fallopian canal. Don't come on the fallopian, on the nerve, expose the nerve and all that. Especially the base of the fallopian canal, that is under retrofacial. When you're drilling retrofacial, if you go very close to the facial nerve, and above also if you're very close to them, there is practically no fallopian canal. And just when you're playing around, when you just one hit with either your suction tip or your drill will cause a fracture. You need to realize how much is adequate bone around the facial, which will come out of experience. A couple of millimeters around the facial. I won't go too close. Nor should the facial nerve fallopian canal be too thick, because then the whole purpose is defeated. If you keep a thick facial ridge, then there's no point in doing a transaortic approach. So that balance between a thin facial nerve and a safely thin facial fallopian canal is what you have to achieve.
Yes, sir. One more question from the same delegate, sir. What is the difference between transcochlear type D and extreme lateral approach?
Extreme lateral approach is not transcochlear. The last type D part, no, some parts of it, what I showed you towards the end, the type D extension of transcochlear, that per se is extreme lateral, but extreme lateral involves vertebral artery. It's another dissection altogether. If you want to learn, please join World Scalpels. We'll teach you every of those 60 dissection procedures. Okay, but it is in that area. Okay, further down, extreme lateral involves exposure to the jugular bulb, inferior to the jugular bulb, posterior to the jugular bulb in the area of the craniovertebral junction, and exposure to the vertebral artery, which is not covered in this topic. But it has nothing to do with transcochlear approach.
How do you deal with bleeding from occipital venous plexus?
Occipital?
Venous plexus.
Oh, you just have to pack it. There's nothing that you do. You just pack it with Surgicel, you know. So these are veins which don't cause too much of a problem. You have to be careful. I don't believe in messy dissections. I don't believe in the uh, the anatomy encountering me, the structure encounter. I believe in me encountering the structure. So I have to find it out rather than it finds me out by accidentally appearing out of nowhere. If you know the anatomy well, you will drill the bone nicely. The condyle veins, the veins around all these structures, anything can be nicely, beautifully drilled out, and then slowly, gently controlled. Not a problem at all.
One more question is, when do you use the contra-angle handpieces in translabyrinthine approach?
Very, I don't use, almost never, except in some difficult cases of, when there's a high jugular bulb and other things, when I'm doing a retrofacial tympanotomy, that is when I use, but very rarely. I don't prefer, I don't do any of my autological surgeries or skull base surgeries with the contra-angle. I never use it. It's something that is not on very close to my desk. Very rare, but it's there. I always have a contra-angle. Sometimes I tend to use it less than about 10% of my cases. Always straight handpiece. If you can't get it straight, then you can't access the structure because your bipolar and every other instrument is straight. Okay, just because you've been able to drill like this, that doesn't mean that you'll be able to remove a tumor like that. Okay, it doesn't happen that way.
Sure, and one question is, what are the drill speeds you vary when you drill around carotid and jugular bulb?
See, I have one drill speed. I use the high-speed burr drilling systems, either BNR or Medtronic, or I've also used Carlso Striker. I've used practically everything, predominantly BNR and Medtronic. It's either at 60 or 75,000. I mean, whatever is the highest speed of the drill, I just keep it. In BNR, it's 80,000. I just keep it at 80. It doesn't matter, because if you are going slow on the drill, that means that you're not confident about something. If you know exactly where you are and what you want to do, you want to get away by drilling quickly. Okay. So when I learned under Professor Mario Sanna, the drill pedal was with the nurse. So I had to sit on this end of the table. The nurse was on the other side of the table. The nurse, it was a big shift for me, because when I learned my ENT, I controlled the drill pedal, and I had that habit, of varying drill speeds. But once I went there, I realized that I had only one drill speed. So I have to be correct, I have to be confident, and my control has to be good. The drill speed is for me always above 60,000. I get irritated when I work at 20,000-30,000. Let us say the only time I may probably, if it was that I may reduce the drill speed, is probably on the facial nerve. And when I'm close to the facial, just a little bit, if at all, sometimes, but the way in which you tackle safety is on your size of the drill bit and your control of the handpiece. That's why I hold the handpiece very close. I don't use long shafted burrs. My burr shaft, I hold it exactly like a pencil. Okay.
And any role of endoscopes in these surgeries?
What will you do with an endoscope? There is no role of endoscope. I don't think there's any role of endoscope in lateral skull base surgery, except in a retrosigmoid approach, where you can put hand. In the retrosigmoid approach, I think there is a role of endoscope, but only for exposure, not for dissection. What is the role of an endoscope? I don't understand. For me, it's a non-question. See, you see this picture now, right? Okay, I'll show you this other picture here. Okay, I'll show you this picture here. Okay, what do you want to do with the endoscope? You want to see the flocculus like a football? I can see, if you can see this picture is taken out of a microscopic camera, isn't it? Are you not happy with this exposure? This is exactly what you see. Do you want this to be 10 times bigger? What is the objective of and then lose one hand because and in these areas, do you want to lose one hand and what will you do? Will you use the bipolar with one hand with the endoscope? What is the use of an endoscope in lateral skull base surgery? After this, now you can, there are certain techniques, again, this is a long discussion, but in any of these approaches that I mentioned, translap, transaortic, transcochlear, infratemporal fossa, there is no role of endoscope.
Thank you, sir. And how do you monitor the cochlear nerve during functional excision of vestibular schwannoma?
See, cochlear nerve monitoring, that's again a separate, we have to use, there is a separate monitoring system, a cochlear nerve monitoring system that is used in case we want to do a cochlear implant along with a translabyrinthine approach. Okay, so it's a separate machine. You have to invest in a complete. It doesn't come with the NIM system. It's a cochlear nerve monitoring machine which is applied, and we use the cochlear nerve action potentials to monitor the cochlear nerve, and we actually get the real-time we can do a real-time monitoring of the cochlear nerve. This machine is developed by a Japanese friend of mine, and probably in another webinar we can completely devote ourselves to the intricacies of cochlear nerve monitoring. I think that is another story altogether. It is too complicated to be discussed at this point of time. But yes, if you're doing a cochlear implant with this thing, you have to use a cochlear nerve monitoring. And what is the latest in the cochlear nerve monitoring is now we have what is an intracochlear electrode, which is put into the cochlea. The cochlea also has to be saved. The cochlear nerve has to be saved. Intracochlear electrode is put, and this is connected to the cochlear monitoring apparatus, and we see if it is like putting a dummy cochlear implant. We see if it works. If it works, we put. But then the issue is that if the cochlear nerve monitoring does not give result, if there is no response, that does not necessarily mean that the cochlear nerve, because this is again a study that we've done at the group Otologico with Professor Mario Sanna, and this has come out of a few other centers as well. The opinion is that negative cochlear nerve response does not necessarily mean, because if you go ahead and put a cochlear implant anyway, a lot of those implants actually worked. So this is a work in progress, and that's the reason why it's being discussed in scientific circles, but it's not really protocolized, I would say.
Yes, I think we have come to the end of questions, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for an exhaustive lecture on transtemporal approaches to CP angle tumors. I think we missed out middle cranial fossa approaches this time. Probably we'll hear you from in the next coming webinars.
Thank you, Bhargav. It's been a pleasure, and from both me and Kavita here, thanks a lot. And I'm sure we'll continue to do some of these webinars with you guys and with a few other people. So keep following. For those of you interested in my webinars, please log into my Facebook page, and you'll find most of the information there. Thank you. Good guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.